On a cold and stormy winter night, while Detective John Wilson sat in his office trying to finish some piled-up reports, the phone rang suddenly. The voice on the other end was calm but filled with tension. "You need to come to Richard Collins's mansion immediately. It's disappearing." The cryptic and alarming message was enough to make John drop everything and head straight to the well-known Collins mansion, which had always been surrounded by rumors. Richard Collins was a mysterious businessman, said to have lived in isolation for years after a series of tragedies befell his family. His mansion, located on the outskirts of the city, had always been the subject of legends and whispers. John, a man who relied on facts, decided to investigate the matter personally. He put on his coat and stepped into his car amid the storm, wondering what kind of mystery awaited him at the mansion. As he drove through the dark, rain-soaked roads, lightning illuminated the sky occasionally, revealing the shadows of the surrounding trees as if they were watching him. With every rumble of thunder, his heart raced faster. He felt that something mysterious and dangerous awaited him in that ancient estate. When he arrived at the grand gates of the mansion, he noticed that the lights were off, and it seemed to sit in complete darkness. But what did it mean that the mansion was disappearing? He took a deep breath and approached the entrance. As he opened the door, a musty scent wafted through the air, as if time had stopped in that moment. As he ventured further inside the mansion, he heard faint whispers coming from the dark rooms, as if they were beckoning him in. His heart began to race, but he steadied himself and decided to follow the sound, believing he might find answers to this terrifying mystery. In that moment, he felt something unusual, as if the mansion itself was alive, breathing, and aware of his presence. With each step he took, the darkness grew denser, as if something was lurking in the corners of the mansion, waiting to reveal itself. Would he be able to unravel the mystery of the vanishing mansion, or would he become its next victim? When John arrived at the mansion, the heavy rain had turned the ground into mud, and the wind howled through the towering trees surrounding the estate. The mansion loomed ahead of him, a massive and decaying structure, its once grand facade now crumbling. Ivy climbed up the stone walls, and broken windows stared like the empty eye sockets of a skull. The mansion's vastness and its eerie silence added to the oppressive atmosphere. As John walked toward the mansion's entrance, the large iron gate groaned under the force of the wind, swinging slightly. Despite the storm, there was a deathly stillness around the place, as if the very air inside had stopped moving. He pushed the heavy wooden doors open and stepped inside. The scent of rot and decay hit him immediately. A thick smell of mildew mixed with the stale air of a place abandoned for too long. Dust coated everything. Furniture draped in white sheets stood like ghostly figures in the dark hallways. A grand chandelier hung from the ceiling, covered in cobwebs, casting long shadows as John's flashlight beam passed over it. He moved cautiously through the entrance hall, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor, until he reached a wide staircase that led to the upper floors. That's when he saw the others, 3 figures standing at the top of the stairs, waiting for him. There was Mike Bell, a seasoned crime scene analyst, wearing a grim expression as usual. Beside him stood Sarah Johnson, her forensic kit slung over her shoulder, scanning the room with sharp, calculating eyes. The third investigator, David Adams, was an expert in psychology, his calm demeanor hiding the nervousness that crept up inside him. John nodded to them as they exchanged quick updates on the situation, and together they made their way to the second floor. The hallway, leading to the sealed room, was long and narrow, its floor creaking with each step they took. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, revealing the ancient stone beneath, and the air grew colder the farther they went. At the end of the hall stood the door, an imposing wooden structure that seemed completely out of place in this decayed mansion. It was reinforced with heavy iron chains and rusted bolts, as if someone had gone to great lengths to keep something from coming out. "Who locks a door like this?" Mike muttered, examining the chains. His breath was visible in the cold air, even though it wasn't that cold in the rest of the house. John stepped forward and studied the door closely. "It's not just to keep us out. It's to keep something inside." Using a crowbar, they worked together to pry open the chains and break the bolts, the metal grinding against itself with a loud screech. After a few minutes of effort, the door finally gave way with a deep groan, swinging inward. Dust spilled into the hallway as the room beyond was revealed. Inside, they found a large study, but it was unlike anything they had expected. Bookshelves lined the walls, but most of the books had crumbled into piles of dust, their pages long disintegrated. The air was heavy with the smell of old paper and something else, something faintly metallic. In the center of the room stood a large oak desk, and upon it lay a single leather-bound notebook. There were papers scattered across the floor, but the most prominent feature of the room was the elaborate chalk markings on the wooden floorboards. Strange symbols and diagrams had been drawn in a circle around the desk. Sarah knelt down and examined the chalk drawings closely. "These are strange. Not any symbols I've ever seen before. Almost like a ritual." Mike picked up the leather notebook and opened it. The pages were filled with the cramped handwriting of Richard Collins, detailing his obsession with finding something called the key. His notes described frantic attempts to discover this key and referenced experiments conducted in the basement of the mansion. The words became more disjointed and erratic as the pages went on, suggesting a growing desperation or madness. As Mike read aloud, the team's sense of unease deepened. What had Richard Collins been trying to unlock? And what was the nature of his experiments? The group gathered around the notebook as Mike continued to read. Richard Collins' writing became increasingly unhinged as he described his pursuit of the mysterious key. At first, the notebook detailed academic inquiries, references to scientific journals, historical texts, and experiments with sound waves and frequencies. But as they flipped through the pages, the focus shifted. Collins began to speak of the key as if it were a literal object that could unlock not just doors, but the mind itself. He rambled about dimensions and alternate realities, hinting that his experiments were no longer grounded in the scientific method. His obsession with the key had led him to discover something beneath the mansion, something hidden deep in the basement. "Here," Sarah said, pointing to a hand-drawn map tucked into the notebook. "This looks like a layout of the basement. There's a room marked here that doesn't appear on the mansion's blueprints." David raised an eyebrow. "A hidden room?" John looked closely at the map. Seems like Collins was convinced that this room held the key to whatever he was researching. But what is it exactly? Mike frowned, running a hand through his hair. There's only one way to find out. With the map in hand, they descended to the basement, their footsteps echoing through the hollow halls as they made their way toward what could only be described as Collins's final experiment. The basement of the mansion was vast and labyrinthine, filled with corridors that stretched in every direction. The walls were damp with moisture, and the smell of mold was overwhelming. Dim, flickering light bulbs barely illuminated the way as the group followed the hand-drawn map deeper into the darkness. As they moved, they passed strange markings on the walls, faded symbols that mirrored the ones they'd seen upstairs in the study. The air grew colder, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed around them. The farther they went, the more they felt like the mansion itself was trying to hide something from them. They eventually reached a dead end. a solid stone wall that appeared to block their path. According to Collins's map, however, this was the location of the hidden room. John ran his hands over the wall, feeling for any sign of a hidden mechanism. "There's something here," he said, as his fingers found a loose stone. With a firm push, the stone shifted, and with a grinding noise, the wall slowly slid open, revealing a hidden passage that led even deeper into the mansion's bowels. They entered cautiously, their flashlights illuminating the narrow corridor ahead. The walls were lined with more symbols, etched directly into the stone. The temperature dropped noticeably, and their breaths misted in the air. Finally, they reached a rusted metal door at the end of the passage. "Looks like we've found the room," Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. The door creaked open, revealing a small chamber beyond. Inside, the team found something that none of them could have anticipated. In the center of the room stood a device, a strange contraption made of old, rusted metal, wires, and outdated technology. The device was incomplete, half-finished, and connected to a panel of switches and dials that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. The walls of the room were covered in more of the strange symbols, but these were etched with more precision, as though Richard Collins had spent hours carving them by hand. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and the group could feel the weight of something unseen pressing down on them. Sarah approached the device cautiously, her eyes scanning the various components. "What the hell is this?" she murmured. "It looks like a mix of old electrical equipment, but it's different." David, who had been examining the walls, spoke up. "These symbols, they're not random. It's like they're part of the machine. Some kind of conduit?" As they explored the room further, they found more notes scattered on a table. Collins had been conducting experiments here, using the device to try and unlock something. His notes were vague but referenced opening a gateway or portal to another place, another dimension. He believed the device was the key to accessing these alternate realities. Before they could fully process the implications of Collins's research, they heard a sound, a faint whispering that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. It was soft at first, but it grew louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to communicate with them. "Do you hear that?" John asked, his voice tense. The others nodded, glancing around nervously. That's when they found Mike, sitting in a corner, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. He was shaking uncontrollably, muttering under his breath. "What happened to him?" Sarah asked, rushing to his side. Mike didn't respond. He just pointed weakly toward the device, his mouth moving silently as though he were trying to speak, but couldn't form the words.